He sat in the corner of a darkened room, no lights on, no phone in his hand, no sound except the ticking of a wall clock that hadn't been reset for months. It was almost poetic. The silence felt louder than any scream. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it fills your chest. Every breath he took felt like an effort. Every second that passed, another drop of meaning slipped through his fingers. No one had called in days. No one had noticed he hadn't shown up. And strangely, that hurt more than he expected. He stared out the window at a city moving on without him. And in that moment, it wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was nothing. Nothingness is what scared him most. Because when you stop feeling, you stop fighting. 2 years ago, he was laughing over dinner with friends, texting back too fast, running late to meetings that actually mattered. There was momentum, hope, motion. But little by little, the storm crept in, disguised as overwork, a few losses, silence from people he once called family. Then came the job layoff, then the breakup, then the eviction notice. One domino fell, then another, and another. And suddenly, he wasn't just down, he was invisible. He stopped talking to people because he didn't want to lie and say, "I'm doing okay." He stopped praying because he wasn't sure anyone was listening. And worst of all, he stopped dreaming. Because dreaming required energy, and he had none left. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized the man looking back, not older, just emptier. And in that moment, he whispered a question that terrified him. Would anyone even care if I disappeared? That night he made a decision, not out of rage, not even sorrow, just resignation, a quiet conclusion that tomorrow didn't need to come. He scribbled a short note, not dramatic, not poetic, just factual. One sentence. "I tried, but I couldn't win this one." He folded the paper and placed it on the kitchen counter. Then he walked through the house one last time, the couch with a tear in it, the photo frame with dust, a half-used cologne bottle still on the shelf. It all felt like someone else's life. He turned off every light in the house except one, the porch. And then he sat in the dark and waited for courage, or maybe for weakness. He wasn't sure which. But before he could move, there was a knock at the door. At first he didn't move. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a neighbor with the wrong door. But then the knock came again, softer this time. He opened the door slowly, not even sure why. Standing there was a woman, mid-40s maybe, jeans, a light jacket, eyes kind but tired. She didn't smile right away. She just looked at him for a long moment, like she knew something he didn't say. Then she spoke. "I don't know why I'm here," she said. "I was driving home and felt like I had to stop here. I know this sounds crazy, but are you okay?" He stood frozen. No one had asked him that, really asked, in months. Something cracked inside him. And for a moment words failed. She didn't force anything. She just stepped back and said, "If you want me to go, I will. But I felt like God needed me to check on someone tonight." And just like that, his silence met her faith. He stepped back and let her in. No words exchanged, just a quiet gesture. She sat at the edge of the couch and he remained standing, arms crossed, as if still holding together the last pieces of himself. Minutes passed. Then he whispered, "I was going to do it tonight." The words didn't echo. They landed softly, but they shook the room. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just nodded and said something he'd never heard before. "I believe you, and I also believe that God just interrupted it." His knees gave in. He collapsed onto the floor, not from weakness, but from release. He had carried the weight alone for too long, and now in this small living room with a stranger from nowhere, something sacred was beginning to unfold. She got up and went to his small kitchen. No permission asked, no explanation needed. She made coffee. While the kettle hissed, the silence filled with something new. Presence. Not just hers. God's. She returned with 2 mugs and handed him one. No preaching, no advice. Just presence. He asked her name. Grace," she said, and then added with a half-smile, "Yeah, like the kind you don't earn, but still find." He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he said, "I don't even know how to pray anymore." She replied, "That's okay. God still knows how to listen." They sat, not as strangers, but as two broken souls, sharing warmth and the beginning of a rescue mission neither one had planned. Later that evening, the light outside dimmed, but inside, something was glowing. He told her about the voices, the ones that whispered he wasn't enough, that no one would miss him, that peace was a place he didn't deserve. Grace listened without flinching, without fixing. And when he fell silent, she simply said, "Darkness has a voice, but so does light." Then she did something unexpected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a tiny speaker. From it, a song began to play, soft, sacred, full of raw hope. It wasn't loud, it wasn't polished, but the lyrics wrapped around him like arms. "You are not forgotten, I see your silent tears. I'm closer than the pain, I've been here all these years." And for the first time in forever, he cried. Not in despair, but because his soul finally heard something louder than shame. That night he couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from something new, awakening. Thoughts stirred, memories resurfaced. Moments he had buried began to breathe again. The child who used to pray by the window. The teenager who once believed God would use him. The man who quietly hoped someone still saw value in him. And then, a strange sense of war. He felt it, a silent tug of war in his spirit. Voices trying to pull him back into despair. Whispers of worthlessness dressed in logic, but something stronger pushed back. Not Grace, not the song, something unseen, but present. A blanket of peace wrapped him. He knew deep inside, this wasn't just emotional, something spiritual was breaking. And as he closed his eyes, he whispered the first prayer in years, "God, if you're still there, I'm listening." Morning broke softly, no loud miracle, no angels singing, but something had shifted, undeniably. The air felt lighter, the thoughts quieter. His chest, no longer a battlefield. Grace had already gone. She had left a note. "You're not alone." Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Grace. He read it again. Tears didn't fall this time, but his soul exhaled. He stepped outside. For the first time in weeks, the sun didn't burn his eyes. It warmed his face. He noticed birds. He noticed the neighbor's dog wagging its tail. He noticed life. And he knew the darkness hadn't disappeared, but it had backed away. Because light, even a flicker, is enough to make the shadows retreat. And his flicker had just been lit. He sat with a journal and a pen, not because he was a writer, but because he needed to release the weight inside. The first words were shaky, then one phrase poured out effortlessly, "God, if you're still there, thank you for sending her." He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for success. He didn't even ask for healing, just connection. Something in him had opened, like a wound that was finally breathing clean air. He found himself remembering things, his mother's prayers, his grandmother's hymn, the way he once believed when he was just a kid. The spark wasn't dead. It had been buried, choked by pain, mocked by life, but it was still there, and it was refusing to die. That night, he whispered 4 words before falling asleep. "I want to live." And heaven heard it. The next morning felt different, not because the sun shone brighter, but because he noticed it for the first time in years. He walked slowly to the same bench, the one where everything had started. But this time, he didn't slump in despair. He sat, still alert, as if waiting for something more real than sight. And it came. Not a voice from the clouds, not a miracle on the news, but a whisper within. "You are not broken beyond repair. You are becoming. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it echoed through his soul like thunder wrapped in tenderness. He exhaled, not out of relief, but out of recognition. He wasn't starting from scratch. He was starting from truth. That day, he didn't run from his past. He invited it to the altar and said, "You are part of me, but you will not define me." And the healing began. The shift in his heart couldn't be explained, only felt. That night, he walked into a small, open church. No crowd, no choir, just the faint sound of a piano and the scent of old wood. He sat in the back, unnoticed, and yet he felt seen. The pastor wasn't preaching fire or judgment. He was speaking of grace, of the God who comes after the one sheep that wandered off. "If you're here and you think God's done with you," the pastor said, locking eyes with no one and everyone, "then you don't know the God I serve." Those words struck him like lightning, not because they were new, but because they were true. His chest tightened, tears welled up, but he didn't run. He stood. He walked down the aisle, every step a war between shame and surrender. And when he reached the front, he whispered what he hadn't dared speak aloud in years. "God, if you still want me, I'm yours." Silence followed. And then, peace. The moment he spoke those words, "God, if you still want me, I'm yours," it was as if something cracked open inside him, not loud, not dramatic, but real. He felt light, not because his problems vanished. They didn't, but because the weight he carried for so long finally wasn't his alone. The pastor placed a hand on his shoulder and prayed. He couldn't even hear all the words, but he felt covered. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. He walked home slowly that night, no longer in a hurry, no longer numb. He passed the same alley where he once stood, ready to give up, and whispered, "Thank you for sending that stranger." The street was empty, but in his heart, he knew. He was never truly alone. He woke up before the sun. For the first time in months, there was no dread in his chest, no heaviness pulling him down, only a quiet strength, like a whisper that kept saying, "You're not who you were, you're becoming who I made you to be." He opened his curtains and looked out. Same street, same neighborhood, but somehow it felt new. He made a cup of coffee and sat in silence. No phone, no distractions, just breath. He didn't cry, but if he had, it would have been joy. He didn't have everything figured out. But for the first time, he didn't need to. He had faith, and faith was enough to take the next step. That same day, he packed a small backpack, just the essentials: a Bible, a journal, a change of clothes, and a photo of his family from better days. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay still. The same whisper that once saved him now called him, "There's someone else out there, just like you, and they need to hear your story." So he walked. Out of the apartment, out of the shadows, and into the light of his calling. He wasn't just saved, he was now sent. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a mission. He had survived the storm. Now he was ready to become someone's shelter. He began visiting shelters, underpasses, parks where the forgotten slept. He would sit beside strangers, not to preach, but to listen. Sometimes all he said was, "I've been there." Other times he'd share pieces of his story, how a stranger once looked him in the eye and told him, "You matter to God." It was a simple sentence, but in the right moment, that sentence could move mountains inside someone. And now, it was his turn to speak it into someone else's storm. Where once he had walked through life invisible, now he walked as a vessel. With each person he comforted, something shifted deeper in him. Not only was he healing others, he was healing himself. The man who once felt unworthy of love was now a messenger of grace. He brought food to the hungry, left warm notes on park benches, and whispered prayers over strangers without them even knowing. He didn't need applause, didn't need to be seen, because he finally knew who he was. Not a mistake, not a burden, but a miracle in motion. E ali, naquele propósito silencioso, Ele descobriu sua verdadeira missão na Terra. One morning, as sunlight broke through the clouds, he returned to the same bench where it all began. Taped beneath it was a small envelope. It read, "To the stranger who saved my life. I was going to end it all today. But your words, your eyes, your presence, they reminded me that I matter. I'm going home to try again. Thank you. Please don't stop." His hands trembled as he folded the letter. Tears welled up, not from sadness, but from sacred confirmation. He had become the very lifeline he once needed, not with power, not with sermons, but with presence, with love, with God moving through him. He sat in silence, letting the moment wash over him, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." That evening he walked home slower than usual, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, full of purpose. He looked at the same streets that once felt like prison walls. Now they felt like open roads. The same door he once closed behind him in despair, he now opened with hope. Inside, his tiny apartment was unchanged, but he wasn't. He whispered a prayer, not one of begging, but of gratitude. "Use me again, Lord, whenever you want." In that simple, sacred moment, he realized he had become the miracle he once prayed for. And the man who once walked to the bridge to die was now walking into life, reborn. News of what had happened traveled quietly. Not through headlines, but through hearts. The stranger who had spoken life that day, he never showed up again. No name, no trace. But something about him lingered, like a seed planted in fertile ground. And the man, once hopeless, began to speak to others, just as that stranger had spoken to him. In coffee shops, on street corners, at shelters. He didn't preach. He simply listened, and when the time was right, he shared, "I was there too. I know what it feels like." But God wasn't done with me, and he's not done with you. What started as a whisper became a wave. The man's quiet testimony began touching lives. One person, then another, and another. People who were lost found hope. Those drowning in silence finally spoke, and men on the edge found a reason to step back and breathe, all because one stranger showed up, with one sentence, on one ordinary day. And that sentence didn't just save a life, it ignited a mission. Months passed. And one morning, as he sat near the window, watching the rain trace soft lines on the glass, he took out a notebook and began to write a letter. But this letter wasn't to a person. It was to God. Not a complaint, not a desperate plea. Just a quiet, heartfelt thank you. "I almost gave up, but you didn't give up on me. You sent someone when I least deserved it. You didn't speak in thunder. You whispered, and I heard you." He folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, never sent it, but he didn't need to. God had already read it. Something had shifted, not just in his life, but within him. He began to see the world differently. Where he once saw walls, now he noticed doors. Where he once felt abandoned, he sensed presence. He found a small job helping at a local shelter. At first it was just to stay busy, but over time he realized he was now the one sitting beside others, the one listening, the one being sent. The man who almost ended it all was now saving others, one silent gesture at a time. The pain hadn't vanished, but now it had meaning. Every scar, every tear, every sleepless night was no longer just suffering. It had become a bridge to reach others who thought they were alone, a bridge to speak life into those drowning in silence. He didn't preach, he didn't shout, he simply showed up, like the stranger once did for him. And slowly, word spread. They started calling him the man who listens, but he knew the truth. He was just a vessel, a living answer to someone else's prayer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself alone by the same bench where it all began. The city still buzzed. People passed by, unaware of the miracle that had unfolded here. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet, he heard it again. "You are not forgotten." But this time, it wasn't for him. It was for someone else, someone watching, someone listening, someone on the edge, just like he once was. So now if you're here, if you're reading this, if your heart is aching for a sign, this is it. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. God still sends strangers, and sometimes you are the one. If this story touched you, let it spark something new. Leave a comment. Share with someone who needs it, because the next life changed could be theirs. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and stay close. More stories are waiting, and maybe the next one is yours.